So our mission, if you're just joining us for the first time on Zooms, we did about 50 odd weekly ones between 2020 and 2021, and we're back monthly. So our mission is to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. You can find recorded versions of these Zoom talks, or many of them we've given, certainly within the next 48 hours, 72 hours. Nicole will turn the recording back to the public through our Engage page, and you can click on Engage at our website and go to History Happy Hours and then find them there. I really want to encourage you, if you've not done this and you would like to, also on the Engage page, you can click to our walking audio tour of downtown, as Jack leading you on about 45 minutes from north end of Gay Street all the way over to the Andrew Johnson Hotel. The Legends of Country Music. It's $5.99, and you have to download on your phone the Voice Map app. We'd love to see more and more people use it and give some feedback. So encourage you to do that. Still, I want to thank our City Council members, Lynn Fugate and Charlie Thomas, for sponsoring and supporting this series this year. And so, Jack, I'm going to turn it over to you. Turning Point, the summer of 1921.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks to Nicole for putting this together. Thanks for everybody for joining us. It's fun to see you all again. Can't stay away from this, can we? Anyway, this is it's called the Turning Point, and of course there are lots and lots of turning points in history, but I think 1921 had more than its share. And tonight, in fact, right now, this hour is the 100th anniversary of a violent and pretty bizarre event in Knoxville's history that I'll be talking about in more detail in a little bit. I grew up hearing people say vaguely 100 years ago, and 100 years ago when I was a kid, you always pictured log cabin times. But I think we have to admit that 100 years ago now is really the beginning of what we think of as the modern era. A lot of what we have today, we had the beginnings of, at least in 1921. And the Turning Point was also the name of a play. There was at the Bijou Theater 100 years ago tonight, as it happens. I have not seen that play, but it may not be relevant, but the title certainly is. 1921 was a turning point. It was the old era yielding to the new in multiple fronts across America, but I think especially in Knoxville, maybe more so here than in other places. Knoxville became in 1921 recognizably the city we know today. A little bit of introduction. Knoxville in 1920-21 was home to about 80,000 people. It was suddenly twice as big as it had been a few years earlier because there had been a major annexation in 1917. This was brought in a lot of the city, including parts of South Knoxville, which had never been considered part of the city of Knoxville before. Here's an early map of that era. It was a time when Knoxville expanded. I'm not sure they realized the extent to which they were taking in lots of different kinds of people who didn't necessarily want to live in a city. Knoxville, before the 1917, thought of itself as a progressive and civic-minded city. And with this annexation, they brought in a lot of people who didn't necessarily want to live in a city at all. But it was an interesting place, certainly. There were two daily newspapers, soon to be three daily newspapers, as hard as that might seem to believe. There were two busy train stations that were open all night. There were several movie theaters, perhaps as many as 9 or 10 in the city in 1921. There were still some vaudeville houses. Vaudeville shows were going on at Bijou and Staub's theaters. The tallest building in town was the Holston building, which was 12 stories tall. It now has 14 stories. I think we have a picture of that, don't we, Paul? The Holston building, we know today on Gay Street, has 14 stories. Back in 1921, it just had 12. They were about to add 2 more later in that decade. But this was a period of when we had, I think, just come through a series of traumas, and one was, of course, the World War. And that was it was traumatic everywhere in the Western world, and it was particularly in Knoxville, where more than 200 young men lost their lives. Also, the trauma at the same time, practically the same month as the worst of the war, was the Spanish flu. Yeah, here's some pictures of Knoxville 1921. Great picture of Union Avenue right at Market Square. That's the old Market House, and Kern's Bakery in the background, the Arnstein building, which of course is still there on the left there. And the guy, it's summer, that guy's kind of wiping his forehead. So, anyway, this is it was a time right after this period of traumas, kind of dark traumas, lots of losses of lives. We lost a couple hundred people to the Spanish flu. And then there was the race riot of 1919. If that wasn't bad enough, I think the darkest moment of Knoxville history was that horrible riot that had white and black people facing off against each other with gunfire. We had lots of fierce politics in this era. We like to think of the past as a simpler time, but it certainly was not politically, and actually not in many ways at all. Tennessee, believe it or not, was still a battleground state in 1920. It was often an exception to the solid South in the days when the South was solidly Democratic, when the Democratic Party tended to be conservative, at least in racial issues. But the Tennessee in those days would often go for the Republican, and did in 1920. And the map of 1920 is interesting because Tennessee is about the only state in the South that went for Warren Harding. He's not considered a great president in modern times, but he was uncommitted to Jim Crow, and I think that's the reason that a lot of the South did not like Warren Harding in 1920. But suffrage had passed, and Knoxville seemed ready to accept it by 1921, and a few women were elected to public office in the years shortly to come. And Laura Still's book, which we're proud to publish, will be out in just a few weeks, and we'll give a lot more detail about that. It was a new and unpredictable era, and maybe something that we have in common with 1921 is that it is an unpredictable era after this dark period of trauma, and things may be different. Styles were suddenly very different in the 1920s, especially for women. Women suddenly, for the first time in history, had short hair, bobbed hair. And they wore clothes that a lot of people said looked like underwear, unlike the clothes of their mothers and grandmothers. Jazz was new and very popular. Jazz was all over the place. There were jazz dances on riverboats. I love that fact. There was jazz everywhere. Even a guy on Gay Street opened a dental office, had a live jazz band playing in his office. I don't know how many people you don't like jazz so much, that might not be so popular in a dentist's office, but I'm going to suggest that to my dentist, to have some jazz in there occasionally. Automobiles had never been so popular, but still they were mainly for the affluent. A lot of working people didn't have cars yet. But one of the leading proponents of automobiles was a guy named Cowan Rogers. He ran the Hudson. Here we're catching up with some of that's the Hudson, the Holston building on the corner of Gay and Clinch. Today it has 2 more stories than it has in that picture, but it's still already with 12 stories. That was the tallest building in Knoxville, and it's the most conspicuous building in many old pictures of Knoxville from that time. What's the next slide, Paul? All right, here's catching up. Here's the doughboys going off to war. They're marching down the still steep slope of the 100 block of Gay Street before all this area was covered with the Gay Street viaduct. But they'll come back to a different viaduct. Most of them will come back, at least. Some of those would not come back. Next one. And here's a little Red Cross canteen at the Southern Station downtown. The Red Cross played a key role not only in the war, but also in helping with the Spanish flu around the world. So that was a very important and fairly new organization to Knoxville, was the Red Cross. Next one. All right, here's Cowan Rogers. We're talking about the automobile era. Cowan Rogers, kind of a fun caricature of him. He's the guy that introduced the automobile to Knoxville in 1898 when he built one himself. And of course, as you see, it made a run to Chattanooga in 1903. But in 1921, he was a very prosperous middle-aged guy, who ran the Hudson Essex dealership on Gay Street. Later, of course, was Rogers Cadillac, which claimed, I think, with some validity to be the most durable automobile dealership in the Southeast. He was also a leader in road improvement initiatives, and there are lots of those around here. He was giving a talk in 1921 called "All Roads Lead to Knoxville," and this was not just a speculative thing. There were major national road projects that crossed in Knoxville, including the Dixie Highway and the Lee Highway. And here guys working on the Dixie Highway, which was a brand new highway that led from the upper Midwest down to Florida and came right through Knoxville. And it shared part of the route, including 20 miles of Kingston Pike, with the Lee Highway, which is also brand new, and went from the East Coast to New Orleans and eventually farther to the west, where Mr. Perry lives. But yeah, these two major roads came together in Knoxville and made a big effect on the city's economy. Changed some parts of town, especially Bearden. Our Bearden book is very much about how the Dixie Highway and the Lee Highway coming together suddenly produced this enormous interest in tourist business, motels and motor courts and tourist camps all through the Bearden area. At one time, there were 13 motels in just less than a mile or so of Bearden. But strangers were driving through town every day, and this changed the whole city in some ways. So they gave business to their relatively new Farragut Hotel on Gay Street, and also suggested a demand for something bigger, which would later be the Andrew Johnson Hotel. But besides automobiles were new to most people, but even newer were airplanes, and suddenly we had airplanes in town. Oh, all right, there's another. I just want to mention that golf shot. This is one of the many things that was suddenly part of this new automobile connected town that we had, that you could drive around, and some people actually took the streetcar to Cherokee Country Club golf course. But this is a lot of people drove their cars. It was easier to carry your golf bags, I suppose. But anyway, but the next picture, Paul. This is airplanes were brand new, and this is the Knoxville Aero Corporation. This was an early organization of airplane enthusiasts who got together and built an airfield on Sutherland Avenue. It was then just called Aviation Field. It doesn't have a lot of imagination to that. Some people called it Bearden Field, but it eventually became known as McGee-Tyson Airport, this spot right here. It didn't become McGee-Tyson until 1929. But this is the old aviation field on Sutherland Avenue. So this is where all these planes were taken off. That plane we saw was called the Knoxville, and this was a big plane that arrived here in the summer of 1921. It was the biggest plane ever seen in Knoxville, even though a lot of people had begun flying these Jennies around, these little tiny Jennies trainer planes from World War I. They were suddenly available for cheap surplus, and a lot of kind of wealthy young men who lived up along Kingston Pike were starting to fly Jennies. It didn't take that long to learn to fly them, and they would just go down and start flying around. But then they had this big plane by Curtiss called the Knoxville that came down, and it was a 3-seater. It was the biggest plane anybody had ever seen. It could take up passengers, and this is the beginning of a passenger business that they would fly people around and around town, and also to take interesting excursions over the river and even as far as the Smoky Mountain National Park, which raised a lot of interest in this previously exotic and kind of distant place, the Smoky Mountains, which most people had never seen before. This was a few years before the national park, but I think it started building interest in that. But these are all technological things. Technology was changing in lots of ways. Radio is coming too, but also even cultural things. Art was changing rapidly. The era of Impressionism was over. We had there was a place downtown that called the Lyceum. That was a place where you could see art. This is kind of obviously an old house. It was actually a former mayor's house that had an addition built onto it. Kind of sort of a interesting, odd-looking building. This played a big role in the suffrage story, as Laura knows, and that we have pictures of the interior in that book we're about to publish. But this was also a museum, an art museum, and had art studios in it. And people like Catherine Wiley knew this place well. Catherine Wiley, the Impressionist. But Impressionism was the hot thing probably 15 years earlier, but it was kind of fading in by the 1920s. And Knoxville was not quite ready for Cubism yet. So it was sort of an awkward time for art in some ways, but an interesting and creative time as well. And we did begin to see some surrealism in Knoxville in the 1920s, even among local artists who were interested in this international trend. This is the Lyceum, by the way, is on the corner of Walnut Street and Cumberland Avenue. This is now the parking lot for the post office. It was torn down about 10 years after the period we're talking about. I want to mention just a few artists. Charles Christopher Crouch was one of the people who knew this building well. He was 72 in 1921, kind of a quiet, mysterious fellow, but he was at the height of his fame and influence in his 70s with all these rare images of the Smoky Mountains that he was known to just vanish for days at a time, and we go up and make paintings of the Smoky Mountains and bring them back. This was the time of Branson's studios. Lloyd Branson, who was then in his late 60s, was still running a studio on Gay Street. Catherine Wiley, who I mentioned earlier, the Impressionist, was 42. Her work was starting to take a darker hue. Her work was early work was very sunny. Her work in the 20s was very dark and stormy. And then she was committed to a mental institution in 1926. We don't know exactly what happened to her in that regard. But also, this was the time of Buford Delaney. Buford Delaney was 19 years old. He was still in Knoxville. He was working for Lloyd Branson in a studio on Gay Street, and also doing a good deal of painting himself. So this was a very creative, interesting place to imagine people like Buford Delaney perhaps crossing paths with Charles Christopher Crouch, who was old enough to be his grandfather. But anyway, architecture was changing as well. The Victorian era was completely over and done with. In 1920, architects were beginning to play with kind of whimsical versions of old styles, Spanish revivalist, English cottage revivalist styles, colonial revivalist styles. This house is called Hope Coat, and it was one that was designed by John Fans Staub, S-T-A-U-B, the grandson of the guy that established Staub's Theater. John Fans Staub did this for his aunt over at just off of UT campus there on Melrose Place is where this is. And it's an extraordinary house. If you've seen it either from the outside, especially on the inside, it's an amazing piece of work that actually got national attention in some architectural magazines when it was completed in 1924. But he began working on this, Staub did, in 1921. He was a Knoxville-born, nationally popular architect who became better known in Texas than here. But other things, his erstwhile partner, he had actually agreed in 1921 to be a partner of Barbara McMurray, who were about his age. It was going to be Barbara McMurray and Staub, but he was getting so much work in this suddenly booming city called Houston that he decided to move his practice there. He came back a few times to do some work here in his hometown, including much later the Eugenia Williams house on Lions View. But Charlie Barber was doing interesting kind of work more in the Gothic and medieval styles, revivalist work in UT campus downtown, and also in Sequoia Hills and Kingston Pike. But interesting and kind of fun time to see. I think one of the best places to see 1920s architecture is North Hills, where there's lots of just really you see the real whimsical sense of revivalism of that time, and other things. The Riviera Theater was we'll get back to that. Music was was another thing going on. Interesting kind of new styles coming up. This was partly inspired by radio. Radio was something in 1921 that kids were playing with. There were kids like teenage kids had homemade radios. There was just a thing to do if you were a 14-year-old boy, especially. Build a homemade radio with I think it literally called for cat's whiskers and things like that to go in a crystal to make a radio with, and they would communicate with each other first by Morse code and then by voice. But this was a time that radio was obviously on the next front. It was in 1922. A lot of sources say 1921 was when Knoxville got its first radio station, but I think newspapers make it clear that it was in 1922. Still a teenager named Stuart Adcock started a station called WNAV, which later evolved into WNOX. By the way, WNAV, for obvious reasons, is now called letters of a station in Annapolis, Maryland. But we had those first for whatever reason in 1922. But anyway, Stuart Adcock would found Knoxville's first 2 radio stations. But this began this whole new interest in live music, which had not really been fully developed before this. Radio was later famous for country music, but in 1921, country music was known only to a few kind of old timers who liked it, who liked fiddle tunes. And there were buskers on the street, Charlie Oakes and George Renault and Squire Frank Murphy, who hosted occasional violin contests on Market Square. Roy Acuff was not quite 18 and known only as he was famous in Knoxville, Roy Acuff was, but only as a high school athlete. His career as a fiddler and musician and a very charismatic figure in country music history was still in the future. But this is a rare early picture of Carl Martin and not Carl Martin, but Howard Armstrong and his family. Howard Armstrong is the guy in the middle with the fiddle. He grew up in La Follette, but was spending a lot of his time in Knoxville by 1921. He was only about 12 years old at this time, but he was already playing with another guy named Carl Martin, who was an important blues figure in Chicago in years to come. But you could find them both in Knoxville in 1921 playing on the street, especially on Vine Street. They would just open doors in pawn shops or barber shops, drugstores, and just go in and start playing for whoever wanted to listen to them. But this was also a time that Maynard Baird was. Maynard Baird later had fronted, I think, the most popular jazz band in Knoxville. Was in 1921 a banjo soloist. He was already well known as kind of a humorous performer. Later had fans across the nation on the radio. But we also were developing a cadre of conservationists during this time. And what we have next, Paul, is that? Yeah, here's a picture of these conservationists. Annie Davis, who in 1923 had the idea to start the national park movement. Harry Iams, of course, in the middle, and over here as a hiking group, including Harvey Broom, the youngest of the group, I think, David Chapman and Jim Thompson, and a couple of others. These were people who were, Harvey Broom was much younger than the others, but in 1921, I think David Chapman and Jim Thompson were both in their early to mid 40s, and Harvey Broom was just an 18-year-old. So it was but these were people who were very, very influential, even nationally, as Harvey Broom was. He was later president of the Wilderness Society, which he helped found in the 1930s. But these were people you might have encountered on the street in Knoxville. But there were many more of these people involved, inspired by both, but they were inspired by the art of people like Charles Crouch. They're inspired by automobile enthusiasm of Cowan Rogers, and also by airplane travel, when people got to go up and fly around and see these Smoky Mountains and say, gosh, I wonder what they're like to be down there and be walking through the woods in those mountains, because most people in Knoxville had never done anything like that. And that was all about to burst out and become the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But in spite of this progressivism about the natural environment, there was a new fear of foreigners in Knoxville that we can't overlook. There was kind of a panic in I think the first Red Scare was in 1919. I think that was actually part of the Red Summer, because there was this fear that Bolsheviks had an influence on Black people in America and might foment a revolution here. The panic about communism and anarchism too, which was a real thing then. And it kind of, and I think this reaction kind of spawned a new Americanism, which kind of had people boasting about being American born and being purely immigrants, even though there were 6 immigrants who were elected mayor of Knoxville in the 19th century. In 1921, the Knoxville Chamber of Commerce boasted that Knoxville is free of the undesirable foreign element. Only 1.3% are foreign born. I think that that number is hard to defend, even just based on the people I know about. But it just shows that the 1921 Knoxville was trying to seem like a place you wouldn't have to worry about foreigners. But it was true that the big waves of immigrants that had influenced Knoxville throughout the 19th century, the Swiss and Germans and Irish, and later the Eastern European immigrants, that was more or less over, tailing off at least. And the only one that was not tailing off were the Greeks. We were having Greek immigration through this time, and they were changing the city, I think, for the better in many ways, and become very familiar and prominent in Knoxville by the 1920s. And among them were do we have a next picture, Paul? What's the next one? Yeah, here's some picture like a lot of the businesses on this street in the old city. This is Central Street, looking up toward the White Lily factory. Boston Cafe on the right was one of many Greek-owned restaurants down here. The Atlanta Cafe was down here also, and the Manhattan Cafe was also a Greek-owned place. There were several. In fact, I think most of the Greek-owned restaurants were right along this one block. And later on, of course, the Regas family got here. And this is a very early picture of if you look in the background of the Hotel Watauga. They were on the bottom floor of the Hotel Watauga. And that's the Regas Brothers Cafe, just a little cafe in a hotel. And over the years, the hotel kind of declined as Regas expanded. And that building, the lower 2 levels of that building are still there today. But that was what Regas, that was what became Regas Restaurant, that lasted for almost a century. And of course, right next door is named in its honor as Regas Square. I just thought I'd mention this in memory of Bill Regas, who just died a few days ago. But we're talking next about, what's the next slide, Paul? Is it? Yeah, we're talking about UT now. UT had only 1,000 students in 1921, roughly that. The president was Harcourt Morgan, who was an entomologist from Ontario, Canada. I think a lot of people don't know that. He became very much a Tennessean, but he was born and raised and educated in Canada. But became a very influential figure here. It was under Morgan's administration that UT began really expanding in a big way. I wanted to show that early picture of Old College because they tore it down. They were dealing with the pains of expansion, and they tore it. This is the original 1828 building on top of the hill, and they realized they wanted to build another building there. And this, I think, is the very beginning of the preservation effort in Knoxville. This was not successful, but there were a lot of people who were upset to hear that this building was going to be torn down. It was still bore the scars of the Civil War. It had cannonball holes in it, but it had been there since way long before the Civil War. And this was really the most historic building on the old campus. But they raised money for it. A lot of people spoke out for it, saying how much they loved that building. They raised money to move it so they could build a new building there. And they raised a lot of money, but not quite enough. And it was finally just torn down. And what they built in its stead is what you know, or what we all know as Ayers Hall. And this is an early picture of it with I think 1920s cars around the quad there. cars just aren't that pretty anymore. Maybe they didn't seem pretty in the 1920s, but they do to me. But anyway, Ayers Hall was designed by Grant and Miller, a Chicago architect who did some other work at UT. It's an Elizabeth building with some Gothic flourishes, and we have another picture that you can see if you look up close, gargoyles and so forth. But it's architects told me it's too symmetrical to be a Gothic building. It's Elizabethan revival, but there are actual gargoyles and arches and other aspects of that we associate with Gothic architecture, but kind of a classic, sort of whimsical revivalist sort of a building. But that checkerboard pattern you see on the tower up there is something that was mimicked later on our football field, which was also built at the same time that Ayers Hall was. In fact, they were both long-term projects that took a couple of years to do. But Ayers Hall and Shields-Watkins Field were both built at the same time. This is W.S. Shields, who was kind of the principal donor of money for establishing a proper football field. This was the first regulation football. We've been playing football on non-regulation fields for 30 years before this, but suddenly people at UT, especially Charles Ferris and Nathan Dougherty, who are engineers and also former football players, thought it was really important that we build a permanent regulation football field that didn't have rocks and slopes and things like that, like the previous field had. And of course, this is Harcourt Morgan, the president of UT at the time. But these guys all worked together to make this happen. But Shields-Watkins Field, of course, is the same field that we use today that's right in the middle of Neyland Stadium. And this is the 100th anniversary of it. Those are the original stands, which held 3,200 people, which seemed like a lot of people in 1921. Of course, it's about 33 times bigger now. But this had been a residential neighborhood, a poor residential neighborhood, and they had to just acquire the property and tear down the houses before they started building the football field. But it's been used for 100 years now. That's I think one of the older football fields in the South. Anyway, it was called Shields-Watkins Field, by the way, because William S. Shields we just saw, and his wife Alice Watkins was also honored in the name of Shields-Watkins Field. And these weren't necessarily, the people you see here aren't necessarily hired by UT. You would think, obviously, everything they do on campus today is hired by paid laborers and members of unions and so forth. This was volunteers doing this. They had 800 volunteers among the faculty and students who were making a football field for us here. It was first used for baseball in the spring of 1921, but the first football game there was on September 24th, 1921, almost 100 years ago, when UT beat Emory and Henry by a convincing 3 touchdowns. That was before Neyland's era. Previous coach was there. But anyway, this was significant in a few ways, not just in the history of UT football, but it was also the first significant expansion of campus off of the hill. UT had always just been up on its hill and stayed there without encroaching on any of the surrounding neighborhood until 1921, and suddenly they needed this big space for a football field, so they got it. And it was also the first time that there was an attraction, that there was a reason for students, for non-students, for Knoxvillians to come to UT campus to do anything, and this was to see football games. So this was a big change. UT became part of Knoxville in a way that had never been before in 1921. There was an older sport we were playing here as well. It was called baseball. I mentioned they played UT baseball on this field, but 1921 was a signal year also for baseball, for pro baseball in Knoxville, when they decided that Caswell Park would be a good place for baseball playing. Caswell Park was a fairly new park. It had been established a couple years earlier, kind of as a general purpose park. By 1921, it seemed like the destiny of Caswell Park was to be for baseball, and the first baseball league games were played there with the team known as the Knoxville Pioneers. Knoxville had competitive baseball teams since the 1860s. In fact, in the 1880s, the Knoxville Reds were Southern champions. But it had been a few years since Knoxville had a proper team before 1921, and because they had a proper field to play in. They had a proper team. A guy named Frank Moffitt, who had been a member of the Knoxville Reds back in the 1880s, was still around and was a coach of the Knoxville Pioneers, and or the owner or whatever, the manager, but established the Knoxville Pioneers at Caswell Park in 1921, and that was the beginning of many, many years of pro baseball that would include later even Negro League baseball in the 1940s and 50s on the same field in the same park. But Caswell Park, I think, baseball tradition of Caswell Park also dates to 1921. But what we have next here, Paul? All right, I want to mention that race to give some context on this. Knoxville was recovering from the race riot of 1919, which happened. The worst of it happened right here on this corner. This is the corner of Central Street and Vine. The New York Cafe you see on the left is actually a Greek-owned restaurant, but this was a place where Black and white people crossed paths quite a bit. In fact, this building was owned by Cal Johnson. It was built and owned by Cal Johnson, who had his office upstairs. And you see that little picture of a horse up there. He loved horses up on the second floor there. That was Cal Johnson's office. Cal Johnson was the guy, of course, raised in slavery, who made a big business success of himself after the Civil War, and built. This is one of several buildings that he built or owned in his career in real estate, and also in saloons and horse racing, everything he was involved with. So there were many, I shouldn't say many, but there were several successful Black businessmen who made a success of themselves in Knoxville. Contrary to assumptions, the race riot happened in 1919. A lot of people have claimed that there was a big exodus of Black people from Knoxville, and I can't find any trace of that in the census. In the 1920s, Knoxville had added another 6,000 Black people to the city. And some were prospering, like Cal Johnson, who, by the way, was, I think, 77 years old at the time, and still was a prosperous businessman in Knoxville. Still had this building here, and also his building up on State Street, which I'm glad to say is still there. This building was torn down long ago, but there were 6,000 more new African Americans in the 1920s. But the problem with the annexations was that we annexed a lot of rural and suburban areas, which were overwhelmingly white. So it was a big difference demographically when Black people who had once been about 28% of Knoxville were down to less than 15% of Knoxville after 1917. Next one, Paul. We had a big asset in Knoxville, and that was Knoxville College in the early 1900s. This is the early picture of it. This was, of course, founded in the 1870s, but was really growing into a respected liberal arts institution in the early 20th century. In 1921, Knoxville College had 400 students working on bachelor degree programs, and that made it almost half the size of UT. So Knoxville College was a significant presence in Knoxville, and I think it was bringing in students from farther across the country than UT did. UT was mainly the people who attended UT were mainly Tennesseans. Knoxville College students were from all over the place. A lot of them were Tennesseans, but many were from northern places. But and like UT, here's a modern picture of the same building we just saw. I'm sorry, it's boarded up, and its future is in some question. There are new ideas for it. But there were, like UT, Knoxville College at this time was building a new football field. And there were new signs of a cultural awakening in Knoxville in some ways. Let's go back to that lyric picture, Paul. There were black performers on stage in Knoxville for the first time ever in the early 1920s. There were had everybody from Roland Hayes, a well-known African American singer, performed for mixed race audiences. Marian Anderson, and this is pretty surprising, about 14 years before she was banned from Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. She performed at the Lyric Theater here in Knoxville in the 1920s, and about 30 years before her Met debut in New York. But also, all these things were in fact, these shows were planned by Black people and mid and mixed race audiences, and at the Lyric Theater, which had previously been known as Staub's Opera House. But across the street from the Lyric was the Bijou, of course, and the Bijou, there were Broadway shows like Shuffle Along, which was the first African American all Black Broadway show in Broadway history. The touring version came and played at the Bijou, and this is one of the few times that they opened both balconies to Black people, and I think Black audience members outnumbered white audience members at these shows of Shuffle Along in the 20s. There was much more going on all the time at the Gem Theater down on Vine Avenue, and which had silent movies with live acts often after the movies. And of course, the Carnegie Library was already there up on Vine, thanks to educator Charles Caswell, who was then 50 years old, a really influential guy. Charles Caswell, African American teacher and principal who helped establish the Carnegie Library by getting in touch personally with the Carnegie Foundation. But Knoxville's expansion, I'd say, it meant that the city was whiter than ever, and percentage-wise, even though we had just as many Black people here as ever. The city government was elected at large by the 1920s. It was considered a more progressive styles of government. So there was no Black representation on council from 1912 until 1969. And this was not, I'm not sure if people knew what an impact this had. The Ku Klux Klan was stirring in Knoxville. This is perhaps inspired by the movie Birth of a Nation. The Klan, I'm glad to say, was not very violent in Knoxville, but it was like a secret club, and people would join and talk about how great it was to be white and native-born American and non-Catholic. This is an aspect of the Klan in the 20s. It was different from the Klan in the 1870s. They were anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic. It was mainly just working people who joined it, and it was only really flourished here for 2 or 3 years, as far as I know. But more, I think, more worrisome, and this is kind of shocking when you get into doing suburban history like we did with Bearden, are all the covenants that people entered into when they bought a house in a new development like Sequoia Hills or a lot of other developments around town. Covenants which forbade Black people from purchasing homes from white homeowners. If you bought a house in a lot of these places, you were forbidden by contract to sell your house to a Black person or a Black family. And this, I think, perpetuated and actually enhanced and increased segregation. I think in many ways, Knoxville became more segregated in the 1920s than it had been in the 1800s. And Black Knoxville developed a separate culture based on Vine Street. Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black hotels on Vine Street, right here where the Carnegie Library is. By the way, this is very close to where the Delaney's lived. Buford and Joseph Delaney lived near there. But tonight, I promised a discussion of what happened tonight. This is the 100th anniversary of a particularly strange event in downtown on Hill Avenue. It started when a young woman who was a teacher, a school teacher, who lived in Dante, which was then kind of a rural area, kind of on the north by northwest side of the county, named Jessie Parker, was walking to school. Here's a picture of Dante. Yeah, there it is. I'm not sure how. I think the term is more commonly used 100 years ago than today, although I've still heard people refer to Dante, as some people say. But this is, she lived in Dante or Dante up there, and was walking to Inskip School where she taught, a good ways from her house. It's interesting, crime stories often show you things that you don't find otherwise, and I didn't realize the extent to which people would just would use the train as a commuter route, just like you use a subway. You get on one station and get off at the next station. And she was in the habit of getting on the southern train heading out of town and just getting off at the next station, which was Inskip, and then going to Inskip School from there. But the train was running late that day, so she said, "Well, I'll just walk." It was a couple of miles. She didn't mind doing it. It was a nice day, early morning on a summer day, when she passed a man who began following her, and he attacked her, dragged her into a cornfield, almost strangled her. And so she had a hard time afterwards explaining what happened. She couldn't speak for a couple of days, but left her alone after that. She said her assailant was a black man, and she and other people assumed that she had been raped because she had been unconscious for part of this time and didn't know what happened. But her watch was taken, among other things, and there was a manhunt for her attacker throughout this area. There was a guy, a teenager named Frank Martin, who was cornered in a freight car, an outbound freight car here, who was captured not far from Inskip. But anyway, he was put in jail, and it says something about journalism. I hate to say about my chosen profession, and I think Georgiana might have some perspective on this too. But we journalists played a role in what happened with lynch mobs. Have can't help but notice that when usually a murder or a rape is considered purely a local story, is mentioned in the local paper. But when the perpetrator is a black man and the victim is a white woman, it becomes a national story, and you see this repeated over and over and over. So this story about the attack of Frank Martin or a black person on Jesse Parker, the teacher, was in the Miami newspapers. It was in the Birmingham newspapers. It was all over the place, and this, you see this over and over. And if the attacker or the suspect gets exonerated, that doesn't necessarily make the papers. It's the attack that makes the papers all over the country, especially in the South. And I think this just enhances people's panic about race, and especially in those days. In a way, I think this deserves. I'm sure it's been studied before, but I think that what's reported where and how much of the follow-up is reported, I think is significant to how much how fearful people were about African Americans in this era. But anyway, the Frank Martin, the guy who was arrested, was taken to the county jail, which was known as the county Bastille. I love that fact. It was kind of a castle-like place down on Hill Avenue, and this is a picture of the county Bastille on Hill, and this is where the prisoners were kept in those days. This is the same jail that was attacked in 1919. They blew the doors off and let the prisoners out. It was in the Maurice Mays case. This was I think fresh on the minds, certainly of law enforcement 2 years later, when they had another black suspect in an attack on a white woman. By the way, back up to that previous thing, I want to mention the show at the Bijou Theater was called The Turning Point, and as bad typesetting, romantic drama of Old Virginia. But people went in to see The Turning Point. This is one of the first shows of the season after, they didn't have many shows in the summer because it was too hot at the Bijou, but they were starting to have shows again. And there were people there that Friday night. And as people came into the Bijou that night, they began hearing a ruckus over to the left as they walked into the Bijou over near the courthouse. But that was where the county Bastille was. Go back to the jail picture, Paul. But by this time of the evening, about by 7 o'clock, a mob of several hundred people. This is the day after the attack and after the arrest of Frank Martin. There were several hundred people, mostly boys, they said, and young men were crowded around the jailhouse, and they were demanding to hang Frank Martin, and they were demanding to hang Maurice Mays, who they believed, whether he was there or not, they believed that Maurice Mays was in the jail as well from 2 years earlier, the person that they had failed to hang in that horrible riot a couple of years before, as well as 4 other black prisoners that they were going to string them all up. At least that was their intention, as stated. There were a lot of these people were just teenagers out there, but there were certain people exhorting them on who were old enough to know better, who were shouting at them and saying these people are going to take over our country. They were talking about the Negroes are going to take over our country. But this got worse and worse and worse. This was and Sheriff W.T. Cate was the sheriff of Knox County, and he was the same guy who'd been sheriff 2 years earlier during the previous race riot, the lynch mob riot. And he was the guy who'd seen his jail torn up in 1919, who'd seen his whole house torn up because he lived next door to the jail in 1919. He still lived there. He fixed up his house. He fixed up the jail. He didn't want this to happen again. But he was not. It was not gonna happen. He called in the guardsmen again. He didn't. Apparently, that lesson of not bringing the guardsmen was not one that he learned. But he thought it was important to have some guardsmen. He had guardsmen posted outside the jail with machine guns, and this was. And he stood in the door of the jail, and the jail with a riot gun, which was a sawed-off shotgun, and all of his deputies had guns, pistols and sawed-off shotguns mainly. But this was the crowd just got closer and closer and bigger and kept taunting them. They were shouting that Sheriff Cate was a Negro lover. At least that's how they spelled it in the paper, a Negro lover. But he did not budge. He stood in the doorway of his jail. He was not going to let them get in, not going to let his prisoner out. They threw rocks. They hit some of the deputies with rocks, taunted the deputies. Cate, at about 9 or 10 o'clock that night, established what he called a deadline, which means this is the line, and if you cross it, you're dead. And people began kind of messing with him on that shape, and they seemed to be on the verge of crossing the deadline when there was a shot up from the courthouse lawn. A single shot came from the crowd. That's the way the police reported it. And this is at this point the deputies opened fire on the crowd. They just began shooting, and they said they were shooting over the heads of the crowd to scare them. But they hit a lot of people. And 28 people in all were taken to hospitals with wounds. Some of them were very serious wounds. As far as we know, all the people who were hit by gunfire were white men, except for one white woman who was in the crowd. But this was a major. They kind of backed off at that point, and some of them ran fleeing, and they said actually left their straw hats lying in the street. And if you can imagine the kind of straw boaters they wore in those days, lying in the street of Hill Avenue. There were further problems on Jackson Avenue, because Jackson Avenue is where McClung Warehouse was, and they knew that McClung sold guns, and McClung had guns, and they were going to break in and get some guns in there. And this was, here's some. I think we can let the headlines tell some of the story here. A man shot at county jail in grave condition. That was one of the lynch mob rioters. Assault victim's watch is found in North Gay Street. This is a peculiar turn to the original story. The assault victim, the woman, the teacher, had lost one item, her watch. And someone returned the watch or wrapped the watch up in a piece of paper with a message that indicated that they had the wrong guy. And this is pretty convincing evidence, I would think, that a watch that nobody knows what happened to it except for the perpetrator, it shows up in front of a plumbing business on North Gay Street near Depot Street. And they found it and found this kind of very, very badly written note, which was hard to understand, that indicated that they had the wrong guy. And this got some people in the investigation to start rethinking whether Mr. Frank Martin was the guy they wanted. But meanwhile, there were further bloodshed in Knox County Jail. More than a score are wounded. That's more than that was 28 was the final number were wounded in the hospitals, not counting perhaps 20 more who had minor wounds that they nursed at home without wanting to be in public about having been there. And jail defenders fired on crowd were after Frank Martin. On the right, you see while they were over on Jackson Avenue, CM McClung and Company ship out of city all weapons of every character. This was Charles McClung and Company, and McClung was the guy that established the McClung collection. But they thought it was important to send all of the guns, all of the weapons they had, out of town. Just shipped them right out of town, so that they weren't there to be stolen. And that was sufficiently discouraging to the crowd. But they also went to UT campus. And we just saw the picture of Shields Watkins Field. There were 100 guys on UT campus on Shields Watkins Field that police found planning an assault on the armory, I think where the equivalent of the ROTC at UT was used to train. They knew they had a lot of guns there, so they were going to break into UT campus and get these guns. And the police said there are people with guns at the armory, and they're going to shoot and kill you as soon as you get within 100 feet of that place. And they believed him, and he was probably telling the truth about that, and gave up on that aspect. But anyway, there were lots of problems for a couple of days. By the way, this is another story that I meant to tell in a different way, but this is Maud Moore. This was all happening the same day, the same paper as Maud Moore, the woman who had murdered a guy who had sexually assaulted her in Bearden, and apparently walked or made her way all the way over to what's now Imes Nature Center and hid in a cave there that they now call Maud Moore's Cave. They found her up in the north in Tacoma, Washington, and hiding out under an assumed name the same day. So this was a kind of an epilogue to another crime story of Knoxville in 1921. But it was if anybody tells you 1921 was a simpler time, you might ask that they look at some old newspapers. Anyway, police arrested only a few of the rioters, and one of them was one of the chief instigators, one of the guys who'd been exhorting these young people to open the jail and hang Frank Martin. His name was J.R. Lewis. He seemed to be one of the leading leaders of the lynch mob. Well, when they arrested him and emptied his pockets, they had a bit of a surprise. They searched J.R. Lewis's pockets, and they found a letter in his pockets from King George V. They also found a commendation for valor in battle from the World War I. This was a guy who was considered a war hero for the British Army. He was a Canadian citizen who was leading a lynch mob in Knoxville in 1921. By the way, King George V had wished him Godspeed in the war. This was later dated from 1917, that he was still carrying around with him. But he had some problems apparently, and was discharged from the army before the war was over. And he claimed he did not know what had come over him, and that he suffered from shell shock, which is, I think, what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. He said a few things to the police that he may have thought Sheriff Kate and his deputies were Germans, and that was why he was assaulted. He was challenging them. But anyway, it's a bizarre story. He was, I think they called the embassy. They didn't know what to do with this guy. They sent him away, and that was that. You know, whether this would have happened if not for him, I don't know. But it was a really strange twist to the story, and I'd love to know if there's a way to find out more about it. Anyway, Sheriff Kate, after this, retired from public life after having survived 2 lynch mobs and seeing his jail wrecked or almost wrecked twice in this time. He retired to be a farmer over in the Seven Islands area of East Knox County. He was later better known as a deacon in his Baptist church. But his nephew and son were both later elected sheriff as well. So sheriffing kind of stayed in the family for a while, even at the 1950s. But Knoxville quickly forgot about this strange ordeal. And I hate to end our discussion with of 1921, a fascinating year by any account on that particular story. But if there's a positive thing, I think that was the last real serious lynch mob that I know of in Knoxville history. We didn't have anything after that much. Oh, by the way, here's an anonymous letter received by Dr. J.B. Parker, may cast light on assailant of young woman. Want to finish up that part of the story. Often lynch mob stories end up with a lynching of a guilty party, or presumably an accused party, I should say. And it did not happen that way this time. After several of these interesting contrary clues came about, they re-interviewed. They had the grand jury met. The grand jury met the first time, and Jesse Parker, the teacher, was too upset, was not able to join them. So they unconvened and reconvened a week later. And at this point, she said, I'm not sure that you have the right man, and kind of withdrew her identification of Mr. Martin as her attacker. But this was he was in jail. He was just released from jail because they had the grand jury came back with a no true bill, as they call it. They did not prosecute, and they let him go. The Black community along Vine Avenue raised some money to send him back to his parents in Tuscaloosa, and that's where, as far as I know, where he settled. But anyway, Knoxville kind of quickly forgot about this bizarre and violent story, which made national headlines. But like I say, I hate to end this one because much of the rest of the 1920s was pretty peaceful in Knoxville, and also a pretty creative time that gave us a lot of things that we have today, including the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, radio, broadcast, journalism in general, Volmania, because Coach Neely arrived and gave us that in 1926, and some very memorable architecture, from Ayers Hall to the Andrew Johnson Hotel, which was for half a century the tallest building in East Tennessee. But anyway, we'll end on kind of a happy image. We got the busy spots of Knoxville, which was from that time. This is an overview of the city just weeks after the riot. As it looked, you've probably seen this picture, but it's kind of fascinating to see it. You see Market Square kind of right in the middle there, with the old Market Hall in the center. Kind of just a happy sort of Sesame Street looking place that is able to sweep a lot under the rug. But also there's a biplane you see, kind of indicating this is part of Knoxville's future as well, that biplane up at the top. Anyway, thanks. I love to talk about one year and all the things that happen in a year. And obviously we really just scratched the surface about what happened in 1921. But I really do think that the city changed in absolute ways in 1921, and in years just after that really are ways that we have never gotten. We've kept through all this time, from football to radio to all these other things, the Smoky Mountains. But if there are any questions or comments, I would love to chat with anybody. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. And it's great to see everybody again. And we promise we won't be away so long. We'll be back in another month, and probably another month after that. And who knows what the virus will do to us? But we're going to try to keep having some public events, but try to be careful about those too. So, but appreciate it, and we'll see you all soon. And stay in touch, please, everybody.